I want to get into, we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but finding sort of a balance between humor and more serious elements of a story. Whether it's a difficult situation or whether it's two characters arguing, what have you. But um, for each of you, I'll direct the question to Kevin first. How do you find when reading a book uh, the balance between humor and more serious moments? We have stuff like Terry Pratchett, which is purposefully very satirical and consistent with that satire. And then you have other books where it's infused a bit more sparingly. So, from your perspective, what is the right balance there, or is it more contextual depending on any given author or a given story?
Well, a little bit. My particular books are seen as humorous books, but they're not marketed that way. And they're marketed as action adventure kind of things, and they are. They're action adventure books. But a lot of people, when they're doing the word of mouth thing and they're telling their friends about it, you got to read this book because it's funny. And so they're talking about the humor rather than the action and adventure stuff. And I think that that's kind of an interesting thing, because what's happening with the marketing on the shelf is this is not a humor book, but the marketing word of mouth is this is a humor book. And if you look at stuff that's on the shelf, very few authors actually get marketed as humor authors. Terry Pratchett is your big example, and Douglas Adams being the other one. Those are kind of the big two of like, these are humorous novels in the sci-fi fantasy genre. Maybe, the Xanth books might be another example, but um, these are your humorous books, and everybody else has humor in it, but they don't get marketed that way. It is a much smaller proportion of the overall material, I guess. And then people will say, "Oh yeah, this is also funny," or "This is a really funny book" to begin with when they do their word of mouth. So I think that in terms of it, from the marketing department, the ratio of humor has to be pretty low, just based on the way they do things. That they don't want to think about it as a humor book because aside from those breakouts, they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to market a humor book. It doesn't seem to sell as well. People maybe don't want to be seen as, oh, I'm purchasing a humor book, because maybe that is not seen as a serious read or something like that. And so they want to pick up something that looks a little bit more serious and adult or whatever. And then they feel good about laughing as that's humor is a bonus rather than the main thing that they're coming for. So, but it's in terms of how I write with it. Um, I just have a comic relief character usually in my books, and I don't plot them. It's just situational, and whatever is going on, they might have a comment to drop in there, and there you go. That's how I approach it.
Well, we'll dig into that a little bit more, but I'm curious if anyone else has any thoughts, jumping off on what Kevin just said about sort of like the balance and the marketability of humor and why humor might be looked down upon in a way, from a marketing standpoint or from potentially a reader standpoint, if anyone wants to get in there.
Well, I mean, from a reader standpoint, obviously, I think it's really subjective. I mean, some people, what people find funny is all over the place. I've read so many, so many reviews of my book that say, it's the humor of a 12-year-old boy. And I'm like, have you ever met a 50-year-old boy? It's the same humor. Like, okay, I'm sorry, but yeah. So it's very, very subjective. And then as far as Kevin touched on something for sure there. Like, publishing's very, especially now, they're kind of risk adverse a lot of the time. And I know that when I was trying to get my book sold, like the first publisher that took a look at it wanted most of all the humor taken out, just to try to make it more just like something that had already been successful. So luckily, I managed to find someone that was cool with it slipping in. But even then, they do try to temper it so that, and rightly so that the absurdity of certain things doesn't make the more poignant moments seem less value. But ultimately, when I'm reading a book, I think it only adds to it, because the more I laugh, the more I relate to those characters, the more I'm invested in that story, and the more when something tragic happens, I'm like, it affects me a lot more if I've laughed at those characters.
Mhm. Delilah or
I think
Josiah?
also it's partly because publishers have no sense of humor. Like they were just born without a sense of humor, and that's what drew them to publishing. And
Clueless.
so, just no, but it is
Josiah's
true.
not
Like
trying to
when you
get published. It's fine.
whatever. But it's like I kind of come from a background of like I had my master's in literature, or a lot of like the classics and stuff like that. And boy, if your book had humor in it, it was already lowbrow. I mean, there's just so few books that got elevated to like the canon that had any sort of humor in them. And if they did, it was one of those things you were like, well, you have to understand this humor is an important commentary upon the absurdist of living in this blah, blah, blah. It couldn't just be funny because there was no value in
Yeah.
that. And I think one of the things that maturity has taught me is like, man, there is a lot of value in just laughter and having some fun and enjoying the absurdity of this experience of living, and even if it's not some grand commentary, it's not devoid of value. So
Yeah. Delilah?
Well, and just humor is terribly hard to do well. It's one thing to tailor your humor to a person you've known a long time or a group of people who, share a similar culture as you. But I mean, like you think about stand-up comedians, they go out there and they bomb and they bomb and they bomb, and then they get one joke that gets laughs, and they're like, okay, put that one in the pot, and they bomb for 40 more minutes, and they do that 100 times, then they have 40 jokes, and we can't do that with the book. We get one chance. And if anybody goes, oh, this is not for me, then they don't pick up the book again. So we have to be, very choosy. And it also helps, as a writer to have this whole team of, agent and editors and these other kind of filters that let you know if your joke lands. It may be really fun to you and your family and your friends. Then other people are just like, I don't get it. So
Yeah.
it's, if a book is mostly, adventure and drama, we go along with that. And we're like, oh, sure, these are a logical series of events that happen. And I can go along with that in almost any book. But in humor, if one joke lands wrong, it's like a brick wall coming down. And you just assume this book doesn't work for me.
Yeah, it's a strange thing that humor has that effect that I think people, for some reason, are much more critical of the bad execution than a lot of other things. If there's a bad character, or a mediocre character, let's say, people aren't going to say, "Oh God, that character just ruined everything for me to the point where, out of 15 characters, that one took me out of the book and I did not finish it." Versus a bad joke, which can sometimes land so wrong with somebody that they put down a book and say, "I can't finish that scene," and then it could lead to, "I can't finish that book," or some, yeah.
I feel like it's partly because a lot of readers realize they can't be writers, but most of them think they're comedians. Like they're like I'm funny. Like most of the people that I meet are like, oh, I'm pretty hilarious. Like, well, are you? And it's that sort of they are more critical of humor than they are of the prose.
Yeah, but they don't understand, I guess, the work and the intention that goes into that. And Delilah, like you say, there's so many passes that a book takes in order to get to publication, but those passes also take into account the jokes. And it's like, if the jokes don't land, your editor's going to say something, your agent's going to say something, somebody's going to say something, or if you have a trusted confidant outside of publishing who you bounce your ideas off of, bounce your jokes off of, if it doesn't land with them, that too.
Yeah. Can I circle back something real?
Everything goes through my cat first.
Oh, your poor cat, all this shit that she has to hear.
Oh,
yeah.
Loves it.
Can I circle back to something Nicholas was saying though? I really agree with this idea that if you have characters that people have bonded with through humor and they just sort of like them, then when tragedy strikes or something sort of deeply emotional happens, people tend to feel it a lot harder because they almost weren't expecting it, and so it actually hits them with the force of a tragedy a little bit more than if they were going in expecting to read a tragedy.
Right.
They're prepared. But sometimes when things happen in a book that's kind of light, and then you suddenly bring the hammer down, they find themselves bawling. I've had my sixth book. I had all these emails coming in from people saying, "God damn it, I was listening to this audiobook on the road. And you had me crying so hard I had to pull over." Things like that. And how dare you? And so I think that's something that humor is capable of doing, is actually intensifying some of the other emotions that we feel.